Welcome to Warehouse Automation Matters. I'm Mary Hart, your host, and I am here with Kevin Lawton, the host of The New Warehouse, who just completed his 500th podcast. Welcome, Kevin. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Mary. It's a pleasure to be here on Locus's podcast. I've had Locus on my podcast many times, and I'm happy to see that you guys have started your own as well, and happy to be a guest today.
Thank you. And can you share a little bit about your background and what inspired you to start your podcast, The New Warehouse?
Sure. Yeah, my background has always been in warehouse operations. I kind of fell into that unexpectedly. Did not go to school for supply chain or anything of that nature. I think that's the case with a lot of people, majority of people in the industry. We kind of end up here, as I've found over the years. And I started in inventory control and worked my way up to different leadership positions, from inventory control perspective, quality perspective, overall operations, and building management over time. But at some point, I realized that I wanted to learn more about the industry. Just realizing that this could be a good career potentially, and I decided to embrace it. And ultimately, at that time, this was probably back in 2017 ish, I would say, I was looking for more of that education, and I couldn't really find anything interesting to learn from at that time as a younger person. Then, not as young now, like my mid 20s, late 20s, I guess, at that point, and I was looking for something like a blog or a podcast or video series that would be more engaging at that age, I guess you could say. And there just was nothing there. And I had done some blogging freelance on the side for a different industry in the past, so I thought maybe I'll start a blog. But I quickly realized I was in the middle of a project where we were bringing online a new facility, new warehouse, coincidentally there. Um, and we were doing automation, voice picking, all these different things. And it was just a crazy project. And there was just no time to sit down and write and edit. And my boss at the time, actually, who was guest number 2 on the podcast actually as well, was like, "Oh, you should do a podcast." And that's kind of where the idea really started rolling, and then decided to try and figure it out. And yeah, that's kind of how it got started. And I guess coincidentally as well, we're on the Locus podcast. Our first episode guest was Bruce Welty, one of the co-founders of Locus, actually. So close ties with Locus, I guess, all the way through over the last 5 years and 500 episodes.
Very cool. And what prompted you to name your podcast The New Warehouse?
Oh, that's a good question. It's funny. A lot of times I meet people at conferences and stuff. They're like, "Oh, the new warehouse. What happened to the old warehouse?" We don't talk about the old warehouse. That's usually what I say. But no, the idea behind it was because we were looking at the warehouse itself, and kind of I guess, for if you're watching a video, like behind me, you see the shirt that says "Warehouses are sexy." That was kind of like a initial thought about the idea of this project was, how do we make warehouses sexy in a sense, or like look sexy and highlight some of the things that are going on there. And I kind of realized that, like, oh, there's a lot of technology and things happening in this space. So it's kind of the idea of like, what does, the new warehouse look like, or the modern warehouse? And we've kind of kept that theme, I think, throughout, highlighting a lot of the interesting things that are going on from innovation perspective, technology perspective, and all across the board. Uh, Best, like, ways of doing things, and all those types of things. But that's kind of I guess, the idea of where the name came from, is like thinking of like, what does that new warehouse look like, or what does the warehouse of today look like, or what does the warehouse of the future look like?
Over the last 5 years of hosting your podcast with all the 500 episodes, what major shifts have you observed in the warehouse and supply chain industry?
A lot, actually. The last 5 years is an interesting time, I guess, to start the podcast because so so much has happened in the last 5 years in the industry. But I would say one conversation that I think has certainly changed, kind of overarching in the industry. When I started the podcast in 2019, there was a ton of discussion and talk about the idea of a dark warehouse or a lights out warehouse, fully automated warehouse. And I think over the last 5 years, I think like that discussion has kind of died down, and it's geared more towards the collaborative robotics and how are we enabling people to do more with less, I guess, in the sense is kind of the tagline you hear out there a lot. And I think that's probably one of the biggest shifts that I think I've seen in conversation, because I think even now, as I talk to a lot of different people in the industry who are dealing with robotics, or robotics experts, even they're saying, that idea of like a fully automated warehouse is like way off in the future at this point. And I think the realization is that, that human element is still very much inside the warehouse. While it may be limited because there's a ton of restraints around labor, certainly the pandemic was a big factor in that. And, the ability for workers that maybe would typically be in a warehouse or like a manufacturing job have different flexible options now, at kind of that level of pay, you would say, versus the traditional warehouse role. And so I think the idea of like, enabling the workforce that may be limited in a sense in the warehouse to do more has certainly become a lot more of the discussion and I think focus for a lot of people. And I would say that's probably the biggest shift that I've seen overall.
Great. How has the role of technology evolved in warehouses during your own career when you were working in warehouses, and where do you see it heading in the next couple of years?
Yeah, interesting. Yes, so I've been in the warehousing industry for about 13 years total. So I think that certainly some of the biggest technology things. I mean, even I would say even some of the stuff that's going on right now with robotics and AI and like humanoid robots too. I mean, as a little kid, like I probably didn't even think like this would be something that would happen like this soon in my lifetime, actually. And I think from starting my career like 13 years ago and seeing these different types of robotic applications being brought into the warehouse and what's being done, um, that's certainly amazing to me. And it's just evolved and grown so rapidly just in a short period of time. The technology just continues to get crazier and crazier, I would say. And like, it's really amazing to see those types of applications. I mean, I guess my first operation that I worked in, I mean, we had tons of conveyor, we had voice picking, things like that, which was, pretty nice tech and things that were pretty sophisticated there. But then, seeing some of the stuff that's happening now, I think is just crazy to see that evolution over time, and how some of these applications are being put in. And I think the most exciting thing to me about the space is that a lot of this cutting edge technology that we see out just in the, I guess, general public in the world, whether it's the humanoid robots or AI is some of the most like cutting edge stuff right now and talked about. The practical applications are kind of being found within the warehouse, and I think that's like very exciting for our industry.
Love that. If you had to predict, what would be the biggest change you think that we'll see in warehouses by, say, 2030?
2030.
Will it be that dark warehouse lights out? Will it be more data intelligence? Will there be Rosie the robots walking around the warehouse floor?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, let's see, 2030 is about, I would
6 years
say,
away?
5 years from
Yep.
now. We're about halfway through 2024. So, um, I mean, I would say for sure, I think, and I will say that I don't necessarily I'm not fully on board with humanoid robots from like a personal perspective. I still have some questions about them, and one being like, why do they need to look like us? But I think that, and I think there's recent news around like GXO doing deployment with Agility Robotics and Digit, and not just a pilot, not just a test, like a paid for deployment, which I think is kind of a indicator that there's going to be something more around these humanoid robots. And I think, even though there's questions around form factor, speed of them, and things like that, I feel like there's a long runway there for them to improve and do different things. And I think some of the arguments around them in terms of, they're more suited to be able to have flexibility between tasks, and had an interesting conversation with Matt Dermody from Manhattan Associates, and he was talking about this concept of a virtual gym where for like a humanoid robot, for the AI that's inside them, like the concept of 10,000 hours, right? Like they say you're an expert if you do something for 10,000 hours. Well, you could show one of these robots a task, they could go into their virtual gym, like in their AI mind, and do those 10,000 hours in like a very rapid amount of time, and all of a sudden become an expert on that task, right? So I feel like one thing for sure that we're going to see in the next 5 years is we're going to see more of these humanoid robots coming into the warehouse and being used for different tasks. I think that there's also, I don't know if this will be in 5 years, but I do think that from a humanoid perspective, there is potentially an opportunity for somebody to create almost like a temp agency, but for humanoid robots,
Hmm.
right? So if they're able to create that flexibility in the task that they can do and have that easy kind of training time, I could see a company, having a fleet of these humanoid robots, and an operation saying like, oh, I need 5 of them tomorrow for 4 hours to move boxes or palletize these things. And I could see something like that happening for sure. That would probably be the biggest like jarring impact, I would say, over the next 5 years. But I think we're going to see a lot more focus on the human, and which I think might be a little contrary to what a lot of people would say, especially around like technology coming into play and automation and things like that. But I think that the human is going to become, I think, the human is probably the most important element now in the warehouse, but is becoming even more focused and centered around how do we enable that human to have a better experience when they're in the warehouse, and how do we enable them to do more. And I think we're going to see a lot of technology focused around, whether it's user interface, comfortability from a safety perspective. You see a lot of like exoskeleton kind of stuff coming on the market as well, in terms of helping with the lifting and strength. And I think you're going to see a lot of technology around that, and a lot of company cultures change about how they view the warehouse worker. Because I think for the longest time, I mean, and still in a lot of companies, I mean, I think the warehouse worker is kind of viewed at the bottom of the totem pole, but at the end of the day, like that's really your last line of defense before your product gets to the customer. So I think there's going to be more focus around that. I think the warehouse worker is going to get elevated a little more, and they're going to get kind of that attention maybe that I think they've always deserved from a comfortability standpoint and a technology standpoint.
Speaking of warehouse workers, what advice would you give to someone who's entering the warehouse or supply chain industry today, be it as a worker or further up the ranks?
Ooh, that's a good one. So I teach as well, supply chain, and I have supply chain majors that are students, and yeah, I think my advice to them always is to get that experience on the floor at some point, whether whether they're coming out of school or they're in school and they do an internship where they're able to, or even just pick up like a summer job, just, working in a warehouse, or, maybe over a winter break, they pick up like a peak season shift during the holiday. Getting like that on floor experience, or even if you're just, coming out of high school and want to start somewhere, like start in the warehouse. I mean, uh, getting that on floor experience as you grow through your career is going to give you such a different perspective into how things work and what can work and what can't work from a strategic level as well. And I think getting in touch with that part of the business and understanding that is going to help you to drive improvements, drive efficiencies over time in a much, much different way. And it's going to have a better understanding of that worker on the floor too, as well, to be able to lead them at some point in your career too.
And what are you most excited about in terms of future innovations and developments that you've seen or heard about in the warehouse sector?
What am I most excited about? There's a lot of things going on, for sure. But I think that, I'm most excited about probably the applications for robotic or automated loading and unloading of containers and trailers. I was running an operation where we were doing around 7 to 8 floor loaded containers 5 days a week. Maybe sometimes on a Saturday we do a half day and do 2 or 3 containers. And that was probably, if not the hardest task that I've ever seen in a warehouse operation before. And, incredibly strenuous depending on what's on that container. We were doing commercial lighting, so it was heavy lighting fixtures coming off there, needed to be palletized, and we were using some slip sheets as well with slip sheet attachment on forklift. But I think still there's a lot of kind of awkwardness in unloading it, depending on the variability, because you're trying to maximize the cube in the container. And a lot of times, maximizing the cube in the container means that it's harder to unload from an ergonomics perspective, from a safety perspective. So I think that the solutions that are coming out to try and address that I think are really great. And I think that's really exciting for me to see that, because I've kind of, I guess, lived through that. I mean, luckily I was not really the one unloading every day. But, I've certainly seen, like, the pain of the employees who are doing it, especially in the cold weather and the hot weather in the middle of the summer. Um, and just kind of the overall difficulty in keeping workers in that position as well. That was probably like our highest turnover area, just because of that type of work, and try to alleviate that as many ways as possible. But over time, it's just, you can only, lift and palletize heavy boxes for so long. And so seeing technology address that, I think, is certainly probably the one thing that stands out the most.
And and going back to your podcast, you've interviewed many people over the past 500 episodes.
Yes,
Are
yeah.
there any particular insights or episodes or stories that stood out to you the most as game changers?
And there are so many conversations to think back on. But I would say that, one for sure that stands out to me always is the one with Bruce. I think
Mhm.
maybe it's, first episode. Maybe it's because Bruce just like took a chance on me. I didn't know him before. I just sent him a cold message on
Oh,
LinkedIn, and he said yeah. And then ended up being a super interesting conversation to hear the story about how, Locus kind of came about from Amazon, basically, you know, kicking Bruce and his partners off of Q in a sense, and saying, well, we're gonna do this and we'll do it better. But probably those types of stories like stand out to me the most. Is like, how did people get to where they are? I think it's very interesting to talk to some of the um, more like smaller, mid-size 3PLs, especially because a lot of them interestingly enough, like not coming from like an operations or supply chain background. It's like it's very like entrepreneurial stories where, they typically had like their own e-commerce brand, and then they had a bad experience with the 3PL. They just weren't happy, and they went on to like found their own. And some of the ways they've done it, I mean, it's pretty incredible. Like, I mean, there's I started one in like a old funeral home, and one was in like a dress shop, one in like a storage unit, a garage, like all these different things about how they kind of went after this and figured out operations and how to make it work for them, and now have made themselves into great 3PLs and companies. And those are probably the most interesting to me. And I think some of the other ones that stand out are with some of the people that are focused specifically on like innovation for their businesses. So I recently had Anna Farberoff from PepsiCo on, and talking about the whole innovation process within Pepsi was just fascinating, and talking about their supply chain where they go from all the way from seed to shelf is what they say, because they apparently like they're one of the biggest potato farmers in the world. I didn't know that until I talked to her, but they grow all the potatoes they use for all the Fritos and Lay's chips companies that they own. They have all their own trucks. So they really own their supply chain end to end, and hearing how they go about innovation with on all those different parts, I think is really fascinating to hear, and I think is really a lot of takeaways for the listener too, on like how they can think about innovation and how to push their company forward as well. So those are probably some of the ones that stand out in those types of conversations. But every conversation, I mean, is incredibly insightful, and I learn something every time, and I think that's one of the big motivating factors, is I just keep learning as well along with the audience.
And based on the insights that you've gained, how has your perspective on the industry changed since you first started your podcast? Or does it
Interesting
change every
question.
day or every episode?
No, I wouldn't say it changes every day. I think it just continuously gets more and more exciting. Like I said earlier, I mean, I think seeing some of the things that are happening in the space, and what our industry is able to do, and the access to certain technologies we have as well, to do some of those things, I think makes it more and more exciting and keeps it exciting. And I think, when I said that I kind of fell into this industry unexpectedly, I certainly, like, when I started, was not necessarily like a fan of the industry. And I wasn't like, in the back of my head, I was like, oh, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to do something different. Like, this is just, to get by right now. But then over time, and it's certainly like as I got more exposure through the podcast, like I realized that, like, this industry is pretty cool. Like, there's a lot of really interesting things happening, um, and a lot of different perspectives and ways that people think about things, or come up with ways to do certain processes or tasks within an operation. And yeah, I think it's just, my perspective is probably that I just got more excited about it, and just continue to get excited the more I see, and the more I get exposed to.
Wonderful. And is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners about what's next for the new warehouse, or any upcoming episodes they should look out for?
Sure. So, like you said, we just released our 500th episode as we're recording this, and so that's definitely one to check out. And we talk about some of the that episode actually is just me talking. So actually, believe it or not, through 500 episodes, I think there's only been maybe 4 or 5 that are just me
Wow.
talking. So yeah, so I don't know if that makes that a special one or not. But definitely check that one out, because we talk about some of the future stuff there as well, and some of my takeaways from 500 episodes. But I think the things to look out for, one for sure is, I will say, we're going more and more into YouTube. So I would say definitely check us out on YouTube. We have like additional interviews that we've done at conferences and trade shows that are only on YouTube, actually. So I would encourage people to subscribe there. But I'm putting a big focus on education as well. We've been educating and creating awareness in a way through the podcast or interviews with different solution providers, operators, end users, etc. But putting more of a focus on, I guess, true directed education in a sense, you could say, by putting out more content around some of the warehouse basics and kind of warehouse maybe 101 stuff, you might say. And we've started to do that already through our Warehouse Wisdom Wednesdays, which is an educational email series that anybody could subscribe to. And every Wednesday, basically, you get an email in your inbox talking about one part of the warehouse or one part of a warehouse process. As of this recording, so far, we've done types of warehouses. We talked about the yard. We talked about the dock. We're recording this on a Tuesday, so tomorrow we'll be talking about inbound process. And we'll be just expanding on that more and more as time goes on. And I think that's something that overall top feedback that I've gotten from the podcast is people that are coming into the industry that were not previously in the industry were looking for something to learn about the industry from, and they found my podcast. So to me, I think the natural evolution there is to give some kind of actual education around that, where people can navigate that and learn about those basics and then expand upon those as well in the future. So big focus on education over, I don't know how long, the next years or so, but that's definitely the next big push for us.
Fabulous. Well, thank you for joining us, Kevin. I greatly appreciate it. And again, this is Mary Hart from Locus Robotics, and this is Warehouse Automation Matters, your podcast to help you move what matters.